Y'all are right on cue. Good job. Okay, panelists, y'all ready? I think so. Okay. Welcome to the Baker School. I'm Marianne Wanamaker. I'm the dean here, and it's our pleasure to present the Public Square series tonight. So the Public Square series takes on issues that are relevant in local government here, Knoxville city government or county government. This is, I believe, our third round of this. And the format is a little bit different than we would normally do. So there's going to be a short presentation, and then there will be Q&A. I'll have some of my own questions, and then hopefully this audience is going to contribute some questions as well. So the topic for tonight, as you well know, land use policy, the missing middle, and Knoxville's housing challenge. And when I tell people what we're talking about at the Baker School tonight, they're like, oh, that's a good topic. I'm like, yes, it sure is. And someone asked me on the way in here tonight, they said, is this a topic that your students care about? And I said, yeah. I mean, look how many are here, right? Everybody recognizes that Knox County has a housing challenge. We have a number of ways in which that actually manifests here for us on campus. One of those is that we routinely have individuals who are experiencing homelessness sleeping in our own courtyard. So it is very much part of the campus experience right now, and definitely top of mind, I think, for many people here on campus. So let me do one thing before I introduce our guests, which is just to remind everyone in the audience that this is part of a series. So we have 7 nights of Tuesdays in the Toyota this fall. This is night 2. Next week, this room is going to be packed because the speaker, no disrespect to our current panelists, but the speaker is Danielle Allen, who is Harvard University professor and an expert on democracy and civic engagement, and she's just an outstanding speaker. And she's going to be here. I can't tell you all the details about that day at the moment, but I'm just going to tell you that there's also going to be national media here that day, so if you want to be an extra in a national media clip, you're going to want to be here next Tuesday. The rest of the series, you can see that posted on the posters in our lobby, the remaining guests for the rest of this semester. So we hope you'll come every Tuesday night at 5:30 from now through mid-October for whatever the topic of the day might be. So it's my pleasure to welcome our panelists this evening on our housing topic. So first, I'm going to introduce our own. So Hanson Sale is Government Affairs and Policy Director at East Tennessee Realtors. He's also a UT alum and a Baker School alum, and we're so very proud of all that he's done in his career. Then let me introduce Amy Brooks. So Amy was appointed in 2021 as Executive Director of the Knox County Planning Commission. No, I got it wrong. Say it one more time. Knox County Planning. Okay, and so she was appointed then. That means she was appointed by Mayor Kincannon and Mayor Jacobs jointly. She holds a Master of Urban and Regional Planning, a master's degree in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Michigan, and a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies and Political Science from Maryville College. And she's a member of the American Institute for Certified Planners and a nationally certified public manager. And then finally, let me introduce Amy Midas, who I know is Megan's mom, but that she has other roles as well. She's here representing the Knox County Planning Commission. I shouldn't have said it that way. She's here representing herself. She's also a member of the Knox County Planning Commission. And her goal as a commissioner is to encourage a sustainable, healthy community where residents are able to age in place and enjoy close proximity to work and commerce. Did I get that right, Amy? Okay. Since 2012, she served as both president and vice president of the Forest Heights Neighborhood Association. That's a hard job. And also currently serves on the City of Knoxville's Public Property Naming Committee, Community Forum, and Bearden Village Council. So a very involved leader in our community. So I'm going to start by turning the microphone over to these folks, and Amy Brooks and Hanson are going to do a presentation for us, and then again, as I said before, we're going to turn to Q&A. Okay?
I am going to stand up because I talk with my hands and I don't want to sit down. So I am going to start us off, and then I will hand it off to Amy. So my part of the presentation is why are we even talking about housing, what's going on in Knoxville's housing market. And I'm a data geek, and so this is what I do for the realtors. So first, just what's happened since COVID? That's really when we started talking about housing. Residential home sales reached all-time highs coming straight out of COVID. 2020, 2021, record home sales, very low mortgage rates propelled a lot of home buying. But in 2022, we saw mortgage rates rise and home sales dropped 9%, which is the largest drop since the great financial crisis. So a really substantial decline in home sales. Home values, on the other hand, have increased 65% since 2019. That's about 3 times the historical average over that period. And so affordability has eroded substantially as incomes have not really outpaced 65%. And I think it's important to note as well, a lot of people connect the housing crisis in Knoxville to COVID. While COVID and the pandemic in many ways did exacerbate our housing crisis, this was something we were dealing with previously. So we were number 6 for price growth in 2022, but we've been outpacing the national average in every single quarter since 2018. So this is nothing new. Is it gotten worse? It has, and I'll show you why. So what has been happening recently and what is driving high home prices is just generally a lack of inventory. So you can see here, just back to 2016, if we extended this graph all the way to 2000, you would see even higher inventory levels. But right now, housing inventory is about 60% below pre-pandemic levels. And you can see here in the entire county of Knox County, there's only about 1,500 listings, which is not many. And right now, what's interesting for me as representing the realtors, there is about 1 or 2 realtors for every single listing that's available on the market. So we have twice as many realtors as we have home listings. And at one point in the pandemic, we had 5 realtors for every single listing. So inventory is very, very low. And we really expect that to be the case. This is something that's really, really unique to the pandemic, and it's something the United States has never faced in our history, and it's that a substantial number of homeowners are locked in with very low mortgage rates. So there's a huge financial incentive to stay in place, renovate your own home, don't put your home on the market. And so that in the coming years is really going to be a factor in keeping homes off of the market. So you can see here twice the national average. What we've seen with home prices have grown really substantially, almost hitting 30% growth year over year at one point in 2022. So really substantial. And for the first time ever, at least on record, the median listing price in Knox County in the Knoxville metro area is above the national average. So I was looking through some salary data the other day and saw a recruitment tool that said, we offer this salary, but home prices here are 30% below the national average. It's not true anymore, and it just happened over the last couple of years. And as you can see, it's not going away. At least the data is not suggesting that's the case at this point. And this is also happening in the rental market as well. So it's not just the for sale market. We also see that apartment occupancy was near 99%. I know all of the UT students in the room can sympathize. The University of Tennessee's student housing market pre-leasing rate was 100% for this calendar school year, so no extra rooms or beds available. So we're seeing occupancy across the board. Both homeowners and renters are seeing occupancy levels at historic highs. And that's also provoked really rapid rent growth. Over the past few years, we saw early in the pandemic, rents were pretty level, but all things considered, 2022, 2021, we really saw an uptick, and as a result, we're about 50% higher in terms of average rents than we were pre-pandemic. Again, very substantial. Most people have not seen a 48% salary increase, so a lot of people are feeling the effects of this. And what's really happening is what I call a triple threat in the housing market. It's high home prices, rising mortgage rates that are more than double what they were a year ago and almost more than triple. They're hovering around 7.2% 2 right now, and a lot of people, that has really substantial effects on what you can afford. So people are seeing their budgets change in real time. And low inventory, it's hard to find a house, much less one that's affordable. So this is all kind of culminated in affordability falling to its lowest level since the 1980s, which is really substantial. I was not alive in the 80s, but I will note that mortgage rates were about 18%. Today they're around 7%. So it's substantial to think that at a time when interest rates were 18%, affordability was relatively similar than it is today. That's how quickly home prices have grown, and largely as a result of underbuilding. And what's really important about the housing conversation, we talk about this esoterically, it's important to have housing, but who is being hurt worst by the rapid rise in home costs? And so this is looking at different salary levels. So I pulled the starting salary for a firefighter in Knoxville, a KCS teacher, a police officer, and looked at how many listings that are actively listed on the market for sale can they actually afford. And you can see 1, 2, 5%. And most of those listings aren't really even habitable homes. They're in need of significant repair. So you see that some of our most essential workers, the one that we acutely realized during the pandemic are essential to making our society function, are also the ones who can't afford to live in the county in which they work. And part of this is because of a lack of home building. There's a lot of different reasons for this, but what you'll see here is housing completions relative to household growth. And what you've seen really since 2008, we've been underbuilding substantially, and our estimate at East Tennessee Realtors is that the Knoxville metro area is short roughly 25,000 housing units, which is really substantial and not something we're going to make up with one policy or in any given year. We will definitely have to take an all of the above approach that we'll get into later, but that is really the root of this crisis. And another thing that's important to note about the housing market and how it functions relative to other markets. What this is showing you is the change in price relative to median annual earnings for housing versus all other durable goods. And durable goods are things that you buy every other year, every few years, TVs, cars, home appliances. And what you've seen is over the past half century, the price of durable goods has fallen relative to incomes. Things have gotten cheaper and better. But the housing market has not acted in the same way, and it's in part because of regulatory restrictions, a lot of other different things that we will get into, I'm sure, in this panel, but the housing market supply is not responding to demand in the same way that most markets do. And so to finish up, what is driving all of this housing demand? Why are we in the circumstance that we're in? Certainly consumer preferences have changed. People want office space. People are looking to change from a large metro to a smaller metro, and that's in part migration. We've seen an influx of people to East Tennessee. That means we're a desirable place to live. And when people say, we don't want you here, the reality is the only way to stop growth is to make your community undesirable. If people aren't moving here, then you probably won't want to live here. And so we have to figure out how to confront this challenge. Shifting demographics. There's been a surge of residents who are in their prime home buyer years. So older millennials are looking to upsize. They might have kids, need an extra bedroom. Younger millennials, they're hitting the market for the first time. But baby boomers, on the other hand, another very substantial portion of our population, are nearing retirement age. They're thinking about downsizing, things of that nature. And one that I will harp on a little bit more is smaller household sizes. This is one thing that is going to have an enduring long-term impact on our housing market, and I'll get into why. So looking at our population by generation, I think this is a super cool chart. So this is just showing you visually that the two largest segments of our population are also the people who are in the market to buy homes right now. So a lot of the situation that we find ourselves in is purely just based off of demographics. And you can see there, millennials. I don't know that Gen Z is quite to the prime home buyer age yet, but they're getting there. And it's going to provoke a lot of housing demand moving forward. But one of the biggest crises that we're facing is the composition of our housing stock. There's a mismatch. So 41% of households in the city of Knoxville consist of one person living alone. That's the highest level on record. And what you can see here is there's a mismatch in our housing stock relative to our household sizes. So what you can see, large share of people living on their own, but only 18% of our housing stock is one bedroom or studios. So part of the affordability question is not just that there's way too much demand and not enough supply, but what supply exists doesn't necessarily meet the needs of our population. I'm a living example. I live alone. I'm in a 3-bedroom house. Do I need 3 bedrooms? No, but could I find anything else? No. And that's part of the problem. The affordability problem is also related to we need smaller households or smaller houses for smaller households, and something that's very acute here in Knoxville. And what's the cost of this? Not enough housing really does have a lot of negative externalities. You spend a larger share of your income on housing, that's less money that you're spending at local businesses, that you're investing in your retirement income. You're postponing or forgoing home ownership, which is, a person's home is, research shows is usually the average person's largest asset. Living in more crowded households, living in lower quality housing, if you are in an older home or a less quality home, that has health effects and can help affect how you perform at your job. Commuting farther to work each day, choosing to live and work elsewhere. We talk a lot about trying to attract talent and fill essential workers, to have enough police officers to keep our communities safe. Well, if a police officer can't afford to live in the community that they serve, that's an inherent barrier to recruitment. So there's a lot of externalities that might not readily be apparent, but do have enduring effects. And so I want to last, before I kick it off to Amy, is to make this connection between housing affordability and zoning. A lot of people attribute this crisis to a lack of federal funding, when in reality, research shows that about 75% of our affordable housing stock in this country is actually naturally occurring unsubsidized housing. It's housing abundance. We once had enough relative to our population. Today we don't, and we're feeling the effects of it. And zoning and land use regulations dictate where and what type of housing we build, and thereby have a much larger impact on housing trends than, say, federal funding. And I will finish with expansion on that, is that government in large part, not completely, but in large part, controls the supply side of the supply-demand equation through land use and zoning regulations. We dictate where you can build housing and how much of it, and so government inherently has a role to play as we move forward. So I'm going to kick it over to Amy, who's going to talk more about land use and zoning.
If it's okay, I'm going to move down to the podium. I don't trust myself not to make my way, walk off the stage, so. Thank you, Hanson. Let's see. Oh, make sure I'm going the right way. There we go. So there are several common tools in land use planning. So we have our comprehensive plan, and comprehensive planning is one of the fundamental responsibilities of local government, is to plan for future growth, the development of their jurisdictions, identifies challenges that communities facing, identifies the solution to those challenges, and it really does take the long view. It's an opportunity to provide a vision for the future for the community and what steps need to be taken to get there. It also provides guidance to community members, to planners, to developers, appointed elected officials when we're making critical decisions about land use. We also have something called a subdivision ordinance. This is the primary, this ordinance primarily regulates lot layout, and as well as site improvements and final design. And then finally, we have the zoning ordinance. So this typically controls the location of land uses as well as the density of uses. This is what we'll talk about primarily today. So let's start with a basic overview. What is zoning? Zoning is an umbrella term for usually a vast set of regulations that determine what you can build, where you can build it, and what activities you can engage in on your property. Some common elements that are included in a zoning code are height, setbacks, how far from the property line can your building be, and lot coverage, how much of your land can be used for those buildings. To understand the legal underpinnings of zoning, I think it's important to understand two legal concepts. We have something called nuisance and police power. In essence, nuisance law concerns cases where one person's activity has a negative impact on another person's property. Under nuisance law, if you dump toxic chemicals on my property, or if you dump toxic chemicals and it leaches onto my property and has a negative effect, I can sue you in court for damages. Police power refers to the ability of governments to regulate the affairs of its citizens in order to ensure health, safety, morals, and general welfare of its people. Those are terminology that you'll see in most zoning ordinances across the country. Police power is important because it represents a proactive action to prevent or eliminate harm. For zoning, the idea is that a community can regulate the use of land in order to avoid nuisance conditions before they happen. So these are just some common terms that you'll see in a zoning ordinance. It contains regulations to implement the comprehensive plan. It includes what's permitted, setback, signs, parking, landscape, design, standards, density, site plans. These are all things. It also provides what's allowable and what requires something called a special use or a conditional use. And the special use process typically involves input from community members as well as a planning commission or a planning board, depending on the type of community that you're in. So before zoning, cities mostly regulated what could be built through nuisance laws. And if someone didn't like how their neighborhood was using their property, they took their case to a judge. And as you can imagine, that process soon became quite burdensome, especially in rapidly growing cities like New York City in the early 20th century. In Manhattan, new building techniques were pushing buildings higher and higher, and neighborhoods were getting upset about their loss of sunlight and air. So in 1916, the city responded with what's really considered the first comprehensive zoning ordinance that was introduced. But the basic foundation for zoning in the U.S. was laid out in 1921 with this Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. For many states, the standard acts as they are known still apply the institutional structure, although some procedural and substantial components have been changed. But so states are still following the same sort of standards that were put into place back in the 1920s. So states assign local government zoning authority as an extension of what's called the police powers, which I just touched on a minute ago. In 1926, this is a really landmark case, the Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty, found that zoning ordinances are constitutional under the police power of local governments as long as they have some relation to public health, safety, morals, and general welfare. So this is the most common form of zoning codes, Euclidean zoning, or it's what really most zoning ordinances across the country are based on. So it's a separation of land uses by type, residential, commercial, retail, industrial, etc., divided each into their own zones across a given city. So while Euclidean zoning is frequently associated with development patterns of suburbia, it's the most common form of zoning code, or the local legal tool for controlling land uses and development across the United States. So even in the largest cities, such as New York and other places, Euclidean zoning is the most common. So there are some unintended consequences of this type of zoning. So while there are benefits to traditional zoning, such as preventing the encroachment of industrial zones into residential neighborhoods, there are a number of drawbacks. And one is that it can limit housing type. It can create economic segregation, and it can strain transportation infrastructure by separating uses. In response to some of these drawbacks, new ways of thinking about land use regulations emerged. Form-based codes are a variety of development regulation that depart significantly from land use control approach of most zoning codes in the United States. We have 2 of them here in the city of Knoxville. So while traditional zoning code focuses on the use of land, form-based codes prioritize the form of the buildings based on the belief that the form of the buildings are more important than the use in determining a community's character. So form-based codes address the relationship between building facades and the public realm. They dictate the form and mass of buildings in relation to one another and the scale and types of streets and blocks. There's also something called a hybrid code, which involves meshing those two, so the conventional zoning with the form code. And so it includes graphic urban design, still addresses setbacks and parking placement, but also addresses uses. So now that we've given you a little bit of background on what zoning is, how we use it, I think it's important to provide that foundation, because as these new concepts come into play, we can have a larger dialogue on about that. So let's move to this newer concept that was developed in response to some of those drawbacks of traditional zoning. And I would say it's not terribly new, because an architect, planner, designer, and founder of a firm named Opticos Design, Daniel Perlick, he really coined this term back in 2010, and it's really taken off over the last probably 5 to 7 years. So a lot of communities are talking about missing middle. So missing middle is house scale buildings with multiple units in a walkable neighborhood. Missing middle developments have not just 2 types of development, but at least 3 of the developments that you see here. This diagram represents the full range of housing types in between the scale of the single-family home up to that mid-rise or high-rise multi-unit development. I think it's important to note here that in most neighborhoods built today in the last 40 years, they've either been multifamily or single-family. We have a long history of doing this type of housing. You used to be able to order these plans to fit existing lots and catalogs. And at some point, as I touched on earlier, our rules and regulations changed and this housing became harder and harder to build. And our codes became more focused on density or the number of units and less focused on the scale and the form of the buildings and how they fit into our existing neighborhoods. So why do we call it missing middle? It's called missing because they have typically been illegal to build since the mid-1940s, though they have historically, as I've already touched on, provided an instrumental role in providing housing choices all across the country. We are building very few of this type of housing today, even in our larger cities, New York City, Boston, San Francisco. Middle because they sit in the middle of a spectrum between that single-family home and the mid-rise to high-rise buildings in terms of the form and the scale, as well as the number of units. And the argument could be made for affordability. The market has been focused on the single-family, multifamily for many years now, as I said, and the middle term has really 2 meanings. It represents those scale of buildings, but also relates to attainability. Historically, these types of housing provided housing choices to middle-income families, but I think it's important to note that the missing middle is not exclusively targeting that portion of the market. Research has shown us that there's a large pent-up demand. Hanson touched on this earlier, for this type of housing for many different types of demographics. So baby boomers, single-person households, and millennials who really are desiring a smaller home in a more walkable neighborhood. So where does it work? You need it to be in place in some place. You need to walk to something more than just houses. So missing middle is really intended to be located in what's called a walkable context. So what does that mean? It's not just pedestrian facilities, not just sidewalks or a crosswalk, but you really need to have some place to walk to. So typically as planners, we define the walkable context as a 10-minute walking distance from a center that provides a safe place, pleasant place to walk to either a school, services, shopping, transit. And it can work in a number of different places. So this is a greenfield development. This is a development that Opticos worked with a developer out in Nebraska. They literally designed this entire development on this greenfield site using the missing middle framework. So all of these units fall into that scale. So missing middle can be a great tool to expand housing supply in a really thoughtful, deliberate manner. However, it's just one tool. And it should be used in concert with many others to address housing availability and choice, as well as affordability. I won't go into each one of these, and there's actually probably more that we could add to this list. There's a number of policy tools that you can put into place that should be part of that overall toolkit, along with missing middle. such as identifying tools for incentivizing redevelopment along our corridors, where we already have existing transportation infrastructure, where it might be easier to develop, addressing parking requirements, increasing by right housing developments, and then leveraging maybe underutilized government-owned land, especially in high-cost areas, allowing ADUs. I will say ADUs are probably not going to have a big impact, but they are just another tool. They're a tool for families, for people who want to age in place. Also, expanding residential opportunities in non-residential zones. So making more places mixed use, allowing residential to occur along with office, business parks, commercial areas. And then pre-approved building plans, providing really high quality plans that already meet the requirements of the code. So maybe you have a small scale developer, maybe you have a homeowner, they can take that plan and they know that it's going to get approved. So you're really reducing the cost of development. And thinking about creative use of public-private partnerships. Hanson, feel free to jump in here at the end here. So I think, from my perspective, I think one of the most important takeaways is that you need a multifaceted approach to addressing our housing supply and housing affordability. There's not one single tool or policy that's going to solve all of our challenges that we're facing today, and we need to work in partnership across disciplines to identify what some of those solutions are. And those solutions have to be developed in concert with the community. Anything you want to add, either one of you?
I think we'll...
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so that's a good preview. And can you hear me? Am I on? Okay. So that's a good preview. So Amy closed by saying there's not one solution. There are lots of things that need to happen. But we did kind of choose this evening to talk through the missing middle thing. So my first question for this panel is, can somebody explain to this audience what would happen process-wise in local government for Knoxville, Knox County to be a place where missing middle units are allowed? What's the process that needs to happen?
Our code needs to be amended. One. So we need to have a strategy to update our code. We need to have standards in place. Those need to be presented to the community. We need to get feedback, and that will need to be considered by the Planning Commission, and then it would need to go to City Council to go into effect.
And it doesn't go to County Commission?
Not if it's only located within the city boundaries. Yes.
Okay, and then if the missing middle housing stock is allowable in the county, that goes through the county commission process as a separate process. Is that correct?
Yes, that's
okay,
correct.
So two distinct processes.
Yes.
Okay, all right, that's helpful. Thank you. And then can I ask the panelists if what's your prediction? So let's focus on the Knoxville City for right now. What's your prediction if this zoning code were amended and the change were to be adopted? Are we talking about rental properties that would be in the missing middle, owner-occupied properties, both? What do you think would happen from that perspective?
I'll answer that. It's a little bit of both. So we can't dictate rental versus owner-occupied, and so you get a little bit of both. There's structures in place. You see a lot of owner-occupied where an owner occupies one portion of the housing unit and rents out the rest of them. So it's really a mixture. Predominantly, you'll see probably more rental units, but there's certainly a lot of owner-occupied opportunities. There's some standards that we would need to put in place, HOA and managing one building together, but it can be both, and it's not limited to either.
Okay, I'm going to address this next question to Amy Midas. So in order for all of this to be enacted, there's a process that has to happen, a local government process, and you lead a neighborhood association, which will obviously be part of this. So can you give this room an assessment of whether you think people are ready for this? Have we had the conversations? Are people understanding the connection that Hanson was pointing out between land use, rules and regulations, and our housing affordability challenges? Or do you think there's still some education that needs to happen among Knoxville residents?
Well, I would say that most residents have no idea what zoning is and what uses are for their property. People like me, who was just asked to be the neighborhood president, has gotten involved, and I've made it a point to get engaged in the community and to, realize that these things matter not just to me, but to my neighbors and the neighborhood that I live in. And no, I don't think they do know what's happening. I do think there'll be a good amount of pushback, unfortunately, because unfortunately they probably haven't been engaged and maybe don't realize what has happened. We had missing middle was involved in the new zoning ordinance. We allowed ADUs throughout the city of Knoxville. There was a significant amount of pushback to ADUs.
Will you describe what that is, just in case
it's an accessory dwelling unit that could be built on any property for a single-family residence. Am I doing okay? Yeah. Ideally, you could build an accessory dwelling unit. You could have a child live there. You could rent it out. You could have, you could have your parents live there. Your parents can move there, and they can have a caregiver live in the city. It allows a lot of flexibility for living, a lot of different options, which is a lot of what missing middle is going to allow for the city of Knoxville. But there was substantial pushback, and I would say that was probably the most controversial issue with the whole zoning ordinance that was adopted 5 years ago.
And what's the source of that pushback?
Just uncertainty. We don't have most neighborhoods don't have examples of missing middle working well. They don't. They're afraid. They don't want change.
They don't want the loud cars that you can hear coming up and down Cumberland as we're having this conversation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Fortunately, I live in a neighborhood that has apartment buildings. I have townhomes behind me. I had a triplex that was on my street until about 2 years ago. My mother, who just passed away, she lived in the townhome behind me. I mean, it's great when you have that flexibility, but unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of examples of that in our neighborhood.
So a question to all three of you. Any of you could pick this up. So what is the best way to engage the community? We're sort of in that business here tonight. You gave a presentation. You kind of laid out the argument for this. I'm assuming there are arguments against this that could also be laid out. But what is the process that might get to a healthy civic process on this particular zoning change where people who want to can be informed, can give input? What would that look like?
That's a great question. That's a constant challenge, one that we're constantly reevaluating. We have a staff member who is dedicated to that, to helping us figure that out. It changes depending on the topic. We try all different ways to get people out, but as Amy just touched on, people don't know what this is, so it's hard to get people to come out and engage when they don't really understand what the issues are and what the potential impacts or the potential opportunities are for them. So we try to have forums like this. We try to do open houses. We try to engage people, online, set up surveys. Again, we are always looking for new ideas, especially from a lot of the young people here. How do you want to engage civically in your community?
Well, and I'll add to that. What's fascinating about the connection between the Institute of American Civics and this conversation is that realistically, we are never going to touch every neighbor in every neighborhood and every homeowner. And so there is inequity in part of the process, and that we've seen research show that the people who show up to planning meetings tend not to be representative of the entire community. Does their opinion matter? Yes. And is it important? Yes. But it requires striking a balance in a democracy and a representative government where you have a substantial portion of your citizenry who isn't engaged and isn't interested in being engaged. And so it gets us into these questions of what are the consequences of not having people involved in processes, and how do elected officials who are elected to represent their constituency, were they elected to take a poll and make a decision, or were they elected to listen and then make an informed judgment? So there's a lot of different consequences here, and that, oftentimes when we're talking about what housing is going to go in, we hear from all of the surrounding neighborhoods, but the group that might not have a voice in the conversation is the prospective residents who might live there one day. That voice isn't always represented, and part of my job is to help represent that voice, but it's a challenge when you have a disengaged citizenry who's not involved in the civic process that does have impacts on their daily life.
So I'm not going to ask either Amy to answer this question, but I am going to ask Hanson because he was my student, so I can do this. So, Hanson, do you think this is a situation where the folks who are voting on this, the elected officials who are voting on this, are going to have to make a decision that's unpopular, or do you think there's an opportunity to get the community on board?
That's a trick question.
It's not a trick question.
Realistically, no vote on any land use issue. I think the long history of land use in the United States is that no one's ever happy, and that's part of compromise. And so I think elected officials, in many cases, are going to have to make a decision of, we see this broad community need for housing. We're seeing the impact in our ability to recruit business here. We're seeing the impact on our ability to recruit police officers. We're seeing really negative impacts of the rising in housing prices. We've seen people show up to city council meetings crying because their rent went up $500. And newsflash, a landlord can do that when you don't have any other options. And so I think elected officials are going to have to listen, and you have to balance a broad community goal with some people who are unhappy. But I think there is opportunity. Missing middle, unlike some other options, I think is something that, if we can get the community to understand in a better way, there is an ability to get support. Are we going to have 100% support and consensus? Absolutely not. But I think it's a tough decision for elected officials, and so I kind of skirted that question directly, but
no, I thought that was a great answer. That was a politician's answer. So, I live in a neighborhood that's currently having a total come apart about speed bumps. It's like, people are like, they're at each other's throats over it. So I can't even imagine what's going to happen when we have a conversation about whether you can have multi-unit townhomes or duplexes in that neighborhood. But anyway, I digress. So one way that we could maybe get, or one might get a voter or community member on board, is to give them some sense about how much this might matter. So I'm going to ask all three of you, if you were to back up 10 years, suppose that Knox County had these rules in place 10 years ago, how different would our current housing price availability issue be? And your choices are a little different, a lot different, or somewhere in the middle.
Well, since I'm not the trained one, I'll start with this. I guess I would say that it will allow for more options. I don't necessarily would anticipate that it would make it much more affordable.
So that's a little different.
But I think options,
on a quantitative measure, a little different. On a qualitative measure, different.
Yeah, and
okay.
I think people want options when it comes to moving to a new town, especially young professionals that are moving into town. Not everyone wants to live in a single-family residence. I don't think I was when I was in my 20s. But I don't want to live in a multifamily either. Something mid-size in a neighborhood where I can walk my dog, great. Definitely add to the quality of life.
I think quantitatively it's really hard to know, because we've never lived in a reality in the United States where this housing was allowed post the early 1900s. So I think it could have had a substantial impact. We clearly don't have enough housing. That's in part, research shows that zoning restrictions that are relatively restrictive result in higher home price growth. So I think a little bit is probably the right answer.
I would just say I agree. I think a little bit, but I couch that in this type of development. When we talk about missing middle, we're not just talking about duplexes and triplexes. We're talking about a very specific type of housing that has standards in place that is intended to fit into existing communities and existing neighborhoods. I think if we could get, if that had been introduced, 10, 15 years ago, I think people would be a lot more comfortable with this idea of this type of housing, because hopefully it would look and feel appropriate for their neighborhood. I think there's just a lot of really bad examples of this type of development in our communities as well as other communities across the United States.
So we kind of need to do it and practice with it for a few years and then kind of do something else. Okay. All right. I like that answer. Okay. My last question for the panel, and then I'm going to open it up. So you spent 30 minutes with Baker School students before this panel. What was the best question they asked you? I'm totally putting you on the spot.
They were all really great questions. They really were. Challenging questions.
Well, I think I like the one with what could we do to try to increase housing stock and affordability. And
What could you do, or what could they do?
what could zoning do? What was
Or
it?
what we could do as a government or
as
a
a
community.
government to increase it, or to incentivize private development, which was a lot of economics. I think Nathan
Yeah.
did really
Yeah, I mean,
well.
I think that's I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, what role does government have to play? The housing market, unlike any other, market and durable good, it behaves completely differently, in part because government has a huge role to play in how this market functions and whether supply is able to keep up with demand or respond to demand. So I think the role that government has to play is a really essential one. There's a lot of other things about it, but I think it's a really fundamental question. So I concur.
Great. Okay. So audience questions, raise your hand. We've got two microphones that are making their way around.
You do.
We've got people online, so please do use the microphone so they can hear you.
Did you say that these the middle has been used in other cities before, or it's not been? Because I've got a two-part question.
Yes, it has become very popular. So there are communities that have been moving forward with code amendments that allow this type of housing.
Do we know how that has affected like the lowest income families and homelessness in the areas?
I do not know the answer to that. Do you have any?
Not specifically with missing middle. We haven't. Missing middle so these reforms are so new, and the reality is that we could upend our entire zoning code tomorrow, and it would take a very long time for the practical impact to occur. And so there's not been a lot of research, but the research does show that the cities that have produced housing at a higher rate relative to their population intuitively have kept housing costs in control relative to other cities. So I would presume that the more that we can produce housing on a finite amount of land would be helpful. But generally speaking, new housing, I think there's a misnomer that new housing is generally always affordable to low-income people, which is not the case. There's a concept called filtering where, you're creating a nicer housing option, and somebody from a, marginally less expensive unit moves to that unit. It creates space where they came from, and so it filters down in a way that I think is helpful and has been outside of the 80s, has been really the historical norm of housing in the U.S.
Hi. So I had a couple of questions related to the missing middle. First of all, would Sequoia Hills not be considered a historic example of that? It has townhomes, single unit housing, multi-family housing. It has walkability to a school, to a coffee shop, to a restaurant, to a bookstore. You can absolutely walk your dog. I feel like that would be a really good historical example, which you could also point to as the high quality of life that you would have in such a housing development.
I would concur.
But I want to just say that it has no speed bumps, just so
Yes,
everyone here is aware. Yes.
I'm well aware of the speed bump
okay,
drama that is occurring,
all right.
but I actually think that is a really good example historically of a missing middle development in our community. It's also one of the most desirable places to live. So I don't know the semantics of the definitional components of how you define that, but I'm just wondering if you all have considered that. And then secondly, transforming Western. Is that being designed around that idea of missing middle? Because it sounds so much to me, and when you see the model, I'm just curious if that's being applied conceptually to that idea, to the transforming Western approach.
I agree with you about Sequoia. We do have good examples here locally of missing middle housing, not just in Sequoia, but some of the other other neighborhoods as well. I would say that transforming Western is not specifically looking at incorporating missing middle type housing. There will be a range of, the intent is to have a range of incomes in that housing development, but it's not what I would call missing middle focused.
And
I think it's the range of housing, and again, their plan has not been completely finalized yet, so it could be. I know it's a long process, and there's probably people in the room who are more directly involved in that project. But they haven't actually finalized all of their plans with HUD yet. But it's the range of housing. It's that trying to find those types of units that sit between that single family and the higher density multifamily.
And I'll just add, I agree with you that Sequoia Hills is a good example, but I think it's really great that you bring it up because it couldn't be rebuilt today under our existing codes. And so what is the irony of the conversation we're having today is that the politics in many ways would prevent many of the most desirable places to live in Knoxville from being rebuilt today. The politics of land use it's people's most valuable asset usually, and so they're very invested. And that's the irony of the conversation, is that many of the most desirable places to live are historic examples of mixed use and different housing types, but they're not. We couldn't redo that today under our existing code. So that's you bringing up that example is a really good way to frame it, because it's something that exists that couldn't be rebuilt.
There's your commercial, I think. Okay. Yep. Sorry, go ahead.
Can you hear me? I would completely disagree with Sequoia Hills being an example of an area. Sequoia Hills is an area that is occupied by residents on the highest end of the financial spectrum that we have, and to be saying that Sequoia Hills some grad students, and then my question to you is, what other neighborhoods are you talking about? What other neighborhoods are you using, for instance? Sequoia, I guess I'm trying to say that's a bougie neighborhood. That's a bougie neighborhood, period, point blank. And 4/5 of the people in Knoxville could not afford to be there.
Amy, are there other examples you would offer?
I would say there's some examples in 4th and Gill, Old North, Park Ridge, probably Oakwood Lincoln Park, some other places like that as well. Mechanicsville.
So basically, the historical neighborhoods in town were built in this model.
Yes.
Everything that falls under that category looks like what we're talking about.
There are extremely high income missing middle neighborhoods, and there are extremely low income missing middle neighborhoods. It's really what was left historically.
Okay, helpful.
Hold on.
Oh, sorry.
How would the new stadium that's being built play into this missing middle?
Directly, I think it's a housing type that could be very successful in an urban neighborhood near a baseball stadium. There's issues with how to make that happen, and I think part of the city's current plan, I think, includes some of the surrounding areas to the stadium. So it certainly, I mean, this is the type of housing that I think works in neighborhoods that are adjacent to downtown, that are more urban, more walkable. We need population density. So it's certainly a type of housing that could work in that area.
Hi.
You've got one in the back already? Yeah, go for it.
So you said that a lot of people are pushing back on the on y'all's trying to build the missile middle, and you had an example of like how they might be afraid of a lot of traffic or just getting bothered. Is that the biggest reason, or are there more reasons, or are they just choosing not to agree to it because that's just they're like old fashioned, or I don't know, closed-minded? Is there a specific example?
Well, I think the input process is just kind of starting. So Amy has gotten some information already, but parking can be a big deal.
Oh yeah, that's big.
Yeah, and so the amendments kind of targeted some neighborhoods where there's a lot of on-street parking, so options to parking instead of in a driveway or having to create parking spaces.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you.
Okay.
I had a question about occupancy law. Now, this may not necessarily be a part of zoning. I understand it's more of a municipal code, and it may not be a hot button issue in Knoxville, but I understand it's been very controversial in some other cities, the question of how many unrelated adults can live in a residence. How does that play into zoning and the conversation about land use? Have you heard anything in Knoxville where people are concerned about that or trying to change it?
I think you're right. We don't typically deal with that issue, like in planning and as it relates to the work that we do at Knoxville, Knox County Planning. But it does come up as an issue, especially in areas where you have a lot of students. But specifically for this issue, I don't see it coming up as a significant issue.
Yeah, likewise, I don't think so. But broadly speaking, that has occupancy and the number of unrelated people in a house has been challenged numerous times on federal and state fair housing. Familial status is a protected class, so there's a lot of pushback. I think those sorts of standards are on their way out. Personally, it's something that hasn't really stood muster legally speaking,
And it's hard to enforce.
I imagine. Okay. All right. Well, so that concludes our event. I do want to say that I appreciate the infant in the room. Starting public policy students early is always a good idea. So thank you all for coming. If you're an undergrad and you're not on our mailing list and you want to be, make sure that you sign up outside or you connect to one of us wearing a Baker School tag. And thank you all. Let's give a round of applause to our guests.
I know. Well, we've been Facebook friends, I think.